A couple of weeks ago, I was at a dinner being held in the Oslo City Hall. And there were hundreds of people there at that dinner celebrating the new laureates of the Kavli Prize. The Kavli Prize is a prize in astrophysics and nanoscience and neuroscience. And it was this fantastic dinner in a really stately setting that some of you might recognize because it's the same place where the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony happens every year. Mm-hmm. And I was sitting at my table during a break before dessert was served, and I looked over at the stage, and sitting on the edge of the stage, holding forth with a few guests, was Alan Alda. Now, you probably know Alan Alda as an actor, but he's actually spent a lot of time the last few years working on popularization of science. And he has one of his shows that's devoted to the topic of implicit bias, where he goes and visits the people at Project Implicit, and he takes an implicit association test on the program and talks about its results. So he was sitting over there, and I couldn't really resist, so I went over, and he was, switching between telling stories about MASH and the nightmare called Trump. But when I got the chance, I told him that I loved that video about implicit bias and that I use it all the time, and he got really engaged with me. And I had the pleasure of having a debate for probably 10 minutes with him about this topic and the basic notion of implicit bias. Now, Alan Alda is well known as being a feminist, and he was no less that evening. But he kept coming back to one basic question, which was, he would say, I know that I was slower to associate women with work and men with child rearing, but does that really mean that I discriminate against women when I hire them? So I tried to take him a little further and tell him a little more about that research and what we think we know and what we don't know. But I confess that I was so, hashtag starstruck that it didn't take long before I started thinking about how I was going to get a selfie with him instead of working so hard to help him understand that he, just like me, is a sexist man. So our vision for the KIF committee is that we are an agent for justice and quality in research through gender balance and diversity. The opportunity to work for justice and quality in research is something that I find to be profoundly important and motivating. And I also find it important to think about the pursuit of gender equality and diversity as tools that can be used to achieve those goals, the goals of justice and quality. And talking about these huge issues as tools might seem a bit crass, but I think it's important, and I think it actually can help recruit more men to this cause. Over the past 15 or 20 years, I've personally made a transition from having an interest in gender equality and diversity that was primarily grounded in my own beliefs about social justice to seeing a broader context for that work, which especially started to become clear to me as I moved into leadership positions. And as I made that move, I found myself increasingly responsible for policy developments. First at the center that I led, now at the university that I lead. I was responsible for these policy developments, but in my core, I'm a professor and I'm a researcher, and I found that I didn't like making those decisions without knowing what the evidence was. Mm-hmm. So I started getting more and more engaged with the research. And if there's one thing that I would like for you to take with you from this presentation today, it's this. There is evidence. There is research. There are robust, peer-reviewed, replicated, scientifically valid analyses about gender equality and diversity. Articles that could help Alan Alda see what we know, but that would also show him that there are gaps and that he's absolutely right to ask for more research and more connections and more evidence. Still, the evidence we have is substantial. Excellent articles published in prestigious journals now form a literature that demands our attention. And that evidence shows us time and time and time again the same thing. We are incapable of ignoring what we perceive to be the sex of the person we are interacting with. Academic careers are full of collegial evaluation, and every single one of those points is characterized and influenced by bias, whether it's hiring or publication or promotion or grant applications or feedback in performance reviews. The list goes on. The cumulative effects of this created different career paths for men and for women. Now, I try to emphasize the importance of an evidence-based approach in my own work, and it's important to clarify that research has to be used as a foundation for policy. There's far too much evidence on so-called best practices. We look at what others have done, and that can be a really great way to get inspired to do our own work. But if that project that inspires us hasn't been studied and analyzed, then almost by definition, we don't know why it worked. We don't have enough to justify trying it ourselves. When I was vice president for research at the University of Tromsø, I used to offer women associate professors some days away to focus on their writing. And there would be anywhere from 20 to 40 participants at these events, and they produced results. But which factors were decisive? Was it having a few days dedicated to writing? Was it having a writing coach to talk with? Was it having a senior colleague to talk with? Was it the accountability of meeting up for lunch and dinner and having to tell what you'd written that day? Was it the stunning views of North Norway? Was it finally getting a chance for 8 hours of sleep? I don't know. I haven't studied it. I don't know if anyone has studied it. So suppose you're going to adopt this best practice, but do it a little cheaper and have everyone gather somewhere on campus to write for a few days, but otherwise stay at home. Will that work? I have no idea, because I don't know what the key factors were. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. We need research. And research in this area comes in two flavors. Some research looks at real data and tries to make something out of that. Other research looks at simulations. I'm sure that you know examples of each of these. The most famous simulation is probably the John and Jennifer study, sending out identical CVs to be evaluated. I'm not going to go through that one now because it's so well known. But if you haven't heard about it, I put the references up on my blog, which you'll find by searching on Curt Rice blog. Or if you tweet me at Curt Rice, I'll give you the references. The most famous real data study is the one looking at postdoc applications in medicine in Sweden, in which the analysis showed that for a committee to consider a man and a woman to be equally well qualified for a postdoc, the woman had to have published about 2.5 times as much as the man. Again, if you don't know that one, I've posted the reference. That study is from 1997, but there's a new study from Sweden from 2018 that replicates that earlier one. And this new study looks at hiring practices at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, which is a medical university, to examine whether or not gender is a factor. And the results are kind of interesting because the researchers looked at other relevant parts of the application, such as grants received, publications, citations, all the usual suspects. They looked at these quantitative criteria and correlated them with the likelihood of being hired. Putting it very simply, there was a correlation for men between high performance on the measured variables and getting a job. But for women, there was no correlation there. In other words, it was possible for the researchers to explain which variables led to a man getting a job, but it was not possible to explain that for a woman. Now imagine what that means for women trying to negotiate a career track. Maybe they ask, like we encourage them to, what it is that they're being evaluated on. Maybe they get told that they need to publish more articles or get more grants or supervise more students. But at the end of the day, that only matters for the men. Women can't expect the same rationality, at least not at the Karolinska Institute. They can't expect the same rationality in the way they're treated and evaluated. I don't have so much time here today, so I want to jump ahead to what I think is one of the most important areas for all of us to be familiar with the research about, namely quotas. We all want to talk about different measures that can be used to make things change, to make things better. And the most extreme of these measures is often taken to be quotas. Now, I don't want to argue for quotas here, but I would like to argue a little bit about quotas. So what's the most common objection to quotas. The thing I hear the most about quotas is that they necessarily lead to a reduction in quality. If you use a quota, everyone says, you'll hire someone who otherwise wouldn't get the job, someone who otherwise isn't good enough. That's the stereotype. But what the research tells us is that this is exactly wrong. The research shows us that the use of quotas can in fact raise quality. This, I think, is very, very important. I think everyone who is a friend of the work of gender balance and diversity needs to learn these arguments and needs to familiarize themselves with that research. So, in the case of quotas, what does the research show? Let me mention very, very briefly 3 studies. One study published in Science in 2012 shows that affirmative action and quotas attract more highly qualified women. So the use of affirmative action measures in this study, including but not only quotas, it leads to a change in the applicant pool. In fact, the inclusion of some affirmative action measure in an announcement had the effect of attracting such highly qualified women that it wasn't actually necessary to use the measure to achieve gender balance in the selection. The use of quotas changes the applicant pool. So that old argument that you hire somebody who wouldn't have gotten the job is just not true. You hire somebody who wouldn't have even applied because they're inspired to apply, because they see that someone is concerned to level the playing field. Another study, again coming from Sweden, published in 2013, has the great title, Gender Quotas and the Crisis of the Mediocre Man. This is a paper that examines the effect of quotas on the lists in Sweden for the political parties. So parties there put up a list of candidates for election, and those lists are supposed to alternate between men and women. So they call that a zipper quota that gives 50% men and 50% women on the list. And the researchers developed a measure of group competency. And they demonstrate that the introduction of zipper quotas raises the overall competency of these groups. And it raises the competency of the group of men on the list. Now think about that. Adding a zipper quota raises the competency of the total group and of the group of men. So what does that mean, right? It means that mediocre men are being replaced by more highly qualified women. So the overall competency is raised because you get more highly qualified people replacing lower qualified people. And for the group of men, the lower qualified men are no longer present. So this is a case where the research shows us that a quota regarding the composition of a group increases the quality and competency of that group. This is just a realization of the kind of classical argument that we all use, that society needs to make use of all of the resources that we have. And it shows that exactly the opposite of the stereotype about quotas is what actually happens. And the third study that I wanted to mention very briefly is a study published in the Journal of Economic Behavior. It's called Socially Gainful Gender Quotas. And what they studied in that work is companies where they recruit from within to managerial positions. And they looked at the effects of including a quota in the announcement of saying, we're going to hire 10 managers here and half of them will be women. And what they say in their results is that well, I just read 2 sentences to you. The lure of top positions induces even men of relatively low ability to apply, whereas women of relatively high ability do not expect to get top positions and therefore don't even apply. But gender quotas discourage, they say, they discourage men who are weaker, and they encourage women who are stronger. So that study shows us, again, that the recruitment pool, the applicant pool, changes when you give an explicit signal that you care about gender equality and diversity. These three studies, obviously, are examples of research. They show us that our intuitions are not always reliable. They show us that logic isn't always capturing all the relevant variables. And they show us that there can be best practices, like use of quotas, and that can be reinforced by research. Well, I'd like to go on from that and tell you just a very little bit about a topic I've been especially interested in the last few years, namely the massive gender skewing in the awarding of prizes. I've been especially concerned about the Nobel Prizes, the Nobel Prizes, and I was lucky enough to get the opportunity to speak to the Nobel Foundation earlier this year. I've been nagging them for several years about their gender imbalance. The last 2 years, 0 women won the Nobel Prize. And so they, to their credit, they invited me to come and talk to them about what they might do differently. And the problem that they highlight in their process is regards their nomination list. They feel very bound by the nomination lists. And I think the kind of measures that the Nobel Prize Committee should take should actually be taken for prizes at all levels. If you look at Nobel Prize winners, they all started with their university research prize, and they actually all go a very similar path, from one prize to the next, to the next, to the next. So this, they inherit this problem in part. I did suggest to them that 1 year, one thing they could do that would be absolutely earth-shaking would be to award all the Nobel Prizes to women. I said to them, you've done this 100 times for men, can't you do it once? Once for women. That particular suggestion didn't get much traction there. But we talked about other things. We talked about things like committee members are actually allowed to make nominations. Can they look at the list? Can they add worthy women? Previous laureates are allowed to make nominations. Could they ask previous laureates to be ambassadors for gender equality in the Nobel Prizes and make a special effort to nominate strong women? They could ask the Secretariat to deliver them a short list that's gender balanced. Every year, there are many worthy candidates for a Nobel Prize. But when the short list has 10 names on it and only one of them is a woman, then year in and year out, it's perhaps not so surprising that it goes to a man. But if they add 5 men and 5 women on the short list, maybe that would be different. So all of these different kinds of measures about the nomination lists were things that we talked about. These are things on which there is research, but I don't have time, unless you want to bring it up in the question period, to talk about the kind of research that has been done on nomination processes. That party where I met Alan Alda, as I said, was for the Kavli Prize. And I noted that that's given in 3 areas: astrophysics, nanoscience, and neuroscience. The winner in astrophysics this year was actually a Dutch scientist, Evine van Dishoek from the Leiden University. But in fact, she was just one of 4 women laureates this year out of a total of 7 winners. The study of gender balance and implicit bias is often a little bit depressing. But there is hope to be found here and there. For me, this year's selection of Kavli laureates gives hope. But while it feels good to have hope, we won't actually know if it's justified until we have more research. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience? Any thoughts? Early in the morning. Well, I'll take the chair's prerogative and ask the first question of, when you were saying that the Nobel Prize nominations are pretty fixed, refresh our memory again, it comes in through the research community, or?
Well, so it's different for the different prizes.
Yeah.
So, so if I leave aside the Peace Prize and the Literature Prize, which
Right.
have a larger pool of nominators, but are barely better regarding gender equality, right?
Yeah.
Those are the best, and they have about 15% women. But like this year, one of the physics laureates was a woman, right? That was the first time, the first time in 55 years. Okay, so those nominations do come through the scientific community, but it's still quite limited. It's like university presidents, previous winners.
Right.
It's a relatively
And look
small.
at how much press the physicists received.
Yeah, right.
That was very impressive, and it's such a great idea to maybe for 2020 keep pushing them
Right.
to have all women.
Right, so the Nobel Prize committees, to their credit, know that they have a problem. And the way that they have previously chosen to work with that problem is to give media training every year to all committee members to deal with what they know will be a barrage of criticism about gender equality in the prize.
Any? Yes, do we have a mic? Thank you.
That was a fascinating talk, thank you. So I'm Rebecca Martin, I'm Head of Reward and Diversity at AstraZeneca. And in thinking about the use of quotas, I thought what you said was very interesting, that you could have a quota, it puts off the weaker men, it encourages the women to apply, and in the end you don't need to use it. Exactly. But in an organisation like ours, if we were to implement a public quota system in relation to, you know, an appointment to a senior position,
Right.
we then don't need to use it in practice and the woman gets the job. I mean, what would your advice be for how to eliminate the noise in an organisation which would say that person's got the job but they weren't the best candidate?
Right. It's probably too optimistic to say that the way to eliminate the noise is to orient your colleagues about the research findings. And that doesn't seem to be that doesn't seem to be what guides our feelings about issues. You know, when I got this job that I have now, about 3 years ago, I spent part of the summer before I started at a summer school for new college and university presidents that was held at Harvard. And at least, there were probably 60 of us who participated, at least a third of them were African American. And I talked to them a lot about affirmative action and about quotas. And they would say to me, yeah, of course, I get that all the time. People say, well, we know how you got this job, we know why you got that job. And they say, first of all, I know myself that I've had to work hard to be twice as qualified as the next guy. And I'm just gonna have to take that hit to smooth the way for the next generation. So we have to know that if we would start a more explicit use of affirmative action and quotas in hiring, for example, women into top academic positions, that they're going to be in a tough position, and we need to be prepared to support them on that and talk a lot about the process and why it's important. But we also need to try to prepare them to be willing to take one for the team.
Did you want to give us a tiny snapshot of what's happening at Oslo Metropolitan University?
Well, Oslo Metropolitan University is a brand new university that became a university on January 12th of this year.
Really?
A goal that we've been working towards for many, many years. It's a merger of many colleges and universities. Thank you so much. And I went to that job from a job at the University of Tromsø, which I had worked very, very, very hard to get to grow to be the leading university in Norway when it came to the percentage of women in top academic positions. So we had gone from having 9% to having over 30%. And I was really, really proud of that until I got this job and we became a university, because at Oslo Metropolitan University, 50% of my professors are women, which is, as I'd like to point out, not only national leading, but international leading, because it couldn't possibly be better.
That's fantastic. Well done. 50-50. Fantastic. So you're already on the Agenda 2020 and Agenda 2030.
Yeah, but we got plenty of challenges. I won't deny that. But,
Okay.
but that one seems to be working.
All right. Yes, we have a question here in the middle.
I'm
think it's
impressed
a
that you
black
can
dot.
see that. It's a dark
It is.
sea.
Shirley Malcolm from AAAS. If we look at the issue of the Nobels, for example,
Yeah.
and the idea that you name individuals as opposed to groups, which the Peace Prize does, increasingly that's going to have the effect of shutting out women. Kip Thorne, for example, indicated that he was uncomfortable accepting the prize that a team should have won.
Right.
And so
Right.
this notion of recognizing teams
Right.
is something that I was wondering the kind of impact
Right.
that is likely to have.
Right. Thank you for that very, very important point, which I forgot to mention. So when I had the opportunity to speak to the Nobel committees, it was very important to them to emphasize to me that the science Nobels go to a discovery, not to a person. And they claim that the testament of Alfred Nobel, which they always cite, says that only 3 individuals from that team can be selected to stand on the stage when it's the prize is being awarded. And one of the measures that we talked about was whether that limitation might be changed and whether they might find better ways to recognize a larger part of the team, especially with the developments in the practice of science now having such very large teams. And they fall back on the will, but I would like to point out that the Nobel committees have changed the requirements of Alfred Nobel's testament in other ways, for example, by choosing not to give the award ever posthumously. So it is possible for them to change the requirements, even though they sometimes like to imply that it's not. I think that would be very good for women if the teams were recognized.
Brilliant. Thanks so much.
My
Thank
pleasure.
you.
Thank you.